regular and generous and inspiring guest here at Edible Ed, and it's been wonderful seeing her over the years as her own work, and impact has grown and evolved. So we'll be introducing Shakirah in just a minute. I wanted to also thank you students for the work you're doing with the reflections you're writing. Last week's reflection was to focus on your favorite meal, describing your favorite meal and tracing its roots or its source through the supply chain to its origins. And I wanted to really recognize a couple of students. Ella wrote about her rainbow soup, a favorite, family favorite. And Amrita talked about her baked salmon dinner, and Grace talked about her famous egg on avocado toast favorite meal. And what really stood out in all three of these essays and these reflections was they were personal, they were honest and authentic, and they connected each person's learning and insights to some of the readings and assignments that we've provided. And Rowan White, the Native American seed keeper, came up as really a source of inspiration and guidance, and the podcast that we assigned that many of you listened to was referenced quite a bit, as was our very own Nikiko, who really shared her family's generational connection to growing food. That showed up in a number of the essays as well. So thank you, Ella, Amrita, and Grace, for setting the tone and showing the way for what a great homework assignment looks like. I want to now introduce Charlene, who is the really a very inspiring entrepreneur who I got to meet in Edible Ed last year. Charlene is one of the founders of Food at Berkeley, and we wanted to give her a moment to introduce Fab to you. Hi, Charlene.
Hi, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Professor Will. So, hello everyone. I am Charlene Rojas, and I am one of the co-founders of the Food Association of Berkeley, which was a fun fact inspired by this class. And after I took this class in spring 2020 and met with Professor Will during his office hours, that was pre-COVID, he inspired me to start a club, and now alongside with my peers we are growing. So a little background: we are a group of passionate food enthusiasts committed to building a deeper understanding of food and its systems. We aim to bring in professionals in the industry, networking opportunities, and also social events, all virtually, of course. And we also have some pro bono projects this semester where you can be a part of. No past experience is required. I just want to point that out. We just need your willingness to learn and your love for food. We are also accepting members on a rolling basis, so it is not too late for you to join our family. And if you want to learn more about us, please do not hesitate to reach out. I will post the link in the chat for our membership form, contact information, and also social media accounts. And yeah, just feel free to like reach out to me or the email that I will provide. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Charlene. Thanks for your leadership. It's really inspiring and very generous. And speaking of generous, it's a real pleasure to introduce you now to Nikiko Masumoto, our fearless co-pilot on this semester's class. Maybe you could switch the spotlight to Nikiko. Hi, Nikiko. And I wanted to just honor Nikiko for her many contributions and guidance this semester in helping us to create a really warm, welcoming, brave space to hold this class. And I wanted to give her the privilege of introducing Shakirah tonight. So nice to see you, Nikiko.
Thank you, Will. It is an honor indeed. I feel the honor so deeply to get to introduce Shakirah, who has curated an incredible, powerful conversation for us this evening. So Shakirah Simley, you have access to her bio on our webpage, and I thought I'd introduce her through the ways that I know her. Shakirah, writer, thought leader, advocate, champion of justice and equity, entrepreneur, master preserver, also known as, in the Masamoto family farm, goddess of deliciousness, organizer, policy revolutionary, community development strategist, visionary. All of these words can be used to describe Shakirah. I connected first with Shakirah, I'd like to say, through a pot of jam. The Masamoto family farm, we were super lucky to find some of our peaches and nectarines in Shakirah's kitchens a few moons ago, first as an entrepreneur and through by right. That's how we connected through preserves. As I have gotten to know Shakirah, to me, she emulates the kind of powerful leadership that calls me and calls us collectively toward justice. She's the type of person that when I'm tired at the end of the day, when it's been 100 degrees outside and I'm struggling, just conjuring the image of Shakirah in my mind or listening to her give a talk or reading her words, Shakirah always galvanizes me to dig deeper and keep pressing on. She is the inaugural director of the Office of Racial Equity for the City and County of San Francisco. Let me just say that again. She is the inaugural director for the Office of Racial Equity for the City and County of San Francisco. It is an incredible honor to have her with us this evening and her team of powerful, amazing Black women. As Shakirah reminded us just before, this is right now the time where we can practice what Bryant Terry reminded us in the very first class, to trust and listen to Black women. So I want to invite everybody into their fiercest presence. So let's take 3 breaths together and let's let go of whatever we need to let go of from the day to be fully present. And as we inhale, let's invite in the type of presence we want this evening. So we'll do 3 breaths together. So get comfortable, wiggle around if you want, close your eyes if you want. Inhale and let go, exhale. Inhale, let go, exhale. Inhale and let go, exhale. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. Take it away, Shakirah.
Wow, Nikiko, what an introduction. I wish I could bring you with me everywhere that I go, especially in local government. Thank you so much for that kind and very generous welcome. I am so thrilled to be back here with you all and to actually be the one curating this space and voices. And Nikiko, I just want to say thank you so much. You are also one of my favorite revolutionaries as a farmer, as a poet, as a writer, as a love warrior, as Empress of Peaches. I cannot move out of California because that means I'd be farther away from your fruit, and I don't want to imagine a life in which that is the case. So much love to you and your family for helping me turn magic into jars, but also help fight for justice on behalf of our communities of color in our rural and urban environments. So thank you so much. Seriously, I'm getting emotional over here. Okay. I am so thrilled to be, I always say yes to this class because I feel like this is an opportunity for me to connect with folks who may not know the type of impact you want to make in our food system, who may feel like you have a certain path that you're supposed to follow based on the pressure of your parents, or why you're at Berkeley based on maybe your own dreams that you want to accomplish. And I want to be able to provide, to maybe complicate that for you all just a little bit and understand that your path is not something that's linear, and that there's so many folks and adults in the world who have done this that you can look up to, connect with, and hear from, to help chart a different path of what it means to show up in the food world, and now more than ever, fight for justice and equity. And I am enormously thrilled to be share the stage today with two women that I admire so greatly. We'll have Shelly Dyer, who lives not too far away from me and works in San Francisco, and talking about her work in the Tenderloin to fight for better food access on behalf of our most vulnerable communities, and also for Ashton Berry. Many of you may know her from her social media presence. I know her as a fierce advocate, a fierce hospitality activist, and truth teller when it comes to the work that we need to do to upend racism in our hospitality industry. So without further ado, we're gonna start the class with some grounding definitions. I'll talk a tiny bit about myself. I don't really like talking about myself. You all can read my bio, but once again, I'm Shakirah Simley. I'm the inaugural director for the Office of Racial Equity in San Francisco, which is a government agency that's located within the San Francisco Human Rights Commission. So I work every day with our executive director, Cheryl Evans Davis, to fight for racial justice within the city and county, inside government and outside government too. You may be asking, how does a food person turn into a public servant? I feel like food people are uniquely primed actually to be within government because we know how to serve folks, we know how to show up and understand community, we know how to make people feel at home, and we also know how to make systems that help people feel that are seamless, that are convenient. And I think we need more of that in public service and more of that in politics. I've always done work at the intersection of food, race, class, gender, and equity. I've been doing this work for over 17 years now. And that has been the uniting thread. And that is how I've gotten to my role today. And I want to make sure that it was really hard when I was graduating from college. It wasn't a clear path or ability for me to jump into the food industry. I'm from New York City. I was born and raised in Harlem. The only thing I could do was be a chef. But it took a few key meetings along the way and a really risky move to California without a job or a house or anything like that, to follow my dreams and work with people like Brian Terry to build on what I thought would be a more just and equitable food system. One of the best and scariest decisions I've ever made. And I've been able to parlay my community and economic development work through food businesses, my own business, as a Fulbright scholar, and also as an activist into city government. And I'm extremely passionate about politics. I think all politics are local, and we can talk a little bit more about that in our conversation. So with that said, I want to keep it moving. And this course today, we're going to be talking about anti-Black racism, but understanding how it weaves throughout our food, agriculture, and hospitality system, how that plays out in policy, how that plays out in media and storytelling, and how the women who you have the honor and privilege of listening to today can share their stories to help frame that for you. But I want to go over some really quick slides, and I'm going to ask my fellow panelists to feel free to jump in, and I'm going to be asking you all certain questions maybe you can put in the chat for us to understand this framework. So next slide, please. I think now, like I said, now more than ever, a lot of folks had an awakening in 2020, given the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Some of us couldn't sleep for 30 years plus. It's been a very interesting time, given the racial impacts of COVID, given our Black uprising, given our political turmoil and economic uncertainty. And I'm glad that we have so many more folks whose eyes are wide open, who want to do this work, but we can't fall into performative allyship in order to make that happen. And a lot of the work has been pushed by Black people, especially Black women and Black femme-identified people and Black queer folks. And so the folks who often have the most to lose, who are closest to the pain, have been the ones who have been stepping into their power. And I want to make sure that if you choose to continue to do organizing work and show up, that you respect that, you honor that, you listen, and you're consistent and accountable. Next slide. I wanted to provide some framing to make sure that we understand to make sure that we all understand what it means when we're talking about racism and what it actually looks like. I wanted to ground us with this quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates, who many of you are familiar with. He says, if there's one thing missing in our country, it's an acknowledgement of the broad, one thing that's missing in our country is an acknowledgement of the broad humanity of Black folks. Racism and anti-Black racism in particular is a belief that there's something wrong with Black people, and that permeates every aspect of society in our lives. We live in a heteronormative, capitalist, white supremacist society. That means anyone who does not fit that mold is characterized as other. We have entire systems and institutions and policies that are rooted in those harmful beliefs, and it's up to us to change our behavior, our cultures, our thought, and our actions to upend that system. So let's talk a little bit about what the system actually looks like. Next slide. Next slide again. So I want to first make sure that we understand the different components of racism. And generally when people think about racism, I think they just think about interpersonal interactions, but that's definitely not the case. So first things first, I want to start with internalized racism, which is racism that exists within individuals. It's negative ideas that you have about yourself. And it can be xenophobic feelings about one's it can be xenophobic feelings or an internalized sense of oppression and privilege. So some examples that I can have provided are, folks who use skin bleaching or whitening products, or group or self-blaming. That's another form of internalized or individual racism. If you have any ideas, please place that in the chat of any examples that you want to lift up when it comes to internalized or individual racism. So we're happy to see that. Don't be shy.
May I jump in, Shakirah, really
Yeah,
quick?
yes.
I think with internalized racism, I think so often people get really stuck on the fact that it has to be a specific behavior. And I want to say to everybody that there's no one who's not affected by racism, right? And so whether you believe it or not, or whether it's hard to find, you must always be constantly asking yourself how you fit into the system. Because even if you haven't internalized a specific behavior target towards a person that you can find, you have internalized the system. And so I like to talk about it because internalized racism doesn't always look like the thoughts in your head about a specific group of color. What it can also look like is the way that you've internalized hierarchy and the ways that you've internalized capitalism. They are bedfellows, they cannot be separated.
Thank you. And I'm also wishing that I had Ashton with me for all of my trainings that I teach. Maybe there's a future that we can radically imagine what that's happening. So please definitely jump in as we're talking about this. And Shelly, don't be shy either, because I know you know this stuff as well. If we can go to the next slide. So interpersonal racism, like I said, is the racism that occurs between individuals and groups. And it's the holding of negative attitudes towards a different race or culture, and sometimes follows a victim perpetrator model. So that can be hate speech or behaviors, different actions, attacks. Oftentimes when I think about interpersonal racism, it's an outcome of different beliefs and cultures that are learned, right? And that is a culture that is adopted, right? And we have to be real about where that comes from. And it starts very, very young. My godson was in kindergarten when we had an issue where one of his peers told him that he couldn't come over for a play date because of the color of his skin. And where does a 5-year-old get those ideas from? So this is definitely learned behavior that I also think people are sometimes stuck and to say, I'm a good person. I can't possibly be racist. And I also want folks to understand, interpersonal racism has nothing to do with your personal goodness, nothing at all. And we need to make sure that we are breaking apart those ideas So as Ashton says, this is the outcomes of folks internalizing a system and a set of beliefs. Okay. So I'm seeing some examples in the chat, from microaggressions to racist assumptions about intelligence. I'm seeing assuming someone's wealth or status based on their skin color and different stereotypes and profiling. Someone brought up hiring and interview biases. So yes, those are all examples. But let's keep thinking about how the system of racism is compounding. Okay, so next slide. So institutional racism, and Ashton and Shelley, would love your help here, so we're really clear about what this means. So institutional racism refers to institutional and cultural practices that perpetuate racial inequity, and benefits are structured to advantage powerful groups at the expense of another, regardless of intent, right? And malice, right? So some of the ways that we can be seeing that is through our housing system. For example, some of you may have seen recently in the Bay Area where you've had two sets of one Black couple and a Puerto Rican couple who went to get their houses appraised. And in their appraisal, they received $500,000 less than what their house was actually worth, based on an assumption that folks made. And how, like, yes, there could have been the interpersonal racism and bias from the appraiser, but that's also how generational wealth is not transferred within institutions, right? By these decisions that are being made, and our system of housing allows those sorts of behaviors to perpetuate, right? So that we have white homeowners in their homes and entire neighborhoods being more valued and viewed more worthy than that of Black or brown neighborhoods, okay? So Ashton or Shelley, is there any other pieces that I'm missing here that you want to uplift?
I'd like to jump in there, Shakirah, and just mentioning grocery store redlining practices. That's a practice that is very detrimental to the health of communities. So it goes even beyond generational wealth building, but these types of practices and institutional racism literally impact people's lifespan outcomes. So it's, oftentimes these may be practices that are focused or aimed toward only one specific area of life, such as housing or what types of grocery stores or how many grocery stores are available within a community, but it just trickles across to every single aspect of life. And it's often intentional. It's often very intentional. And some language, Shakirah, that I heard you use last week around policy violence. These are often policies that are enacted when it's very clear what the outcome will be. Low health, few, if at all, any opportunities for building generational wealth within communities that these racist policies are enacted in.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Ashton.
I was just going to add to that, because I think one of the places that's always difficult for us to move from is how we move in the in-between, between the institutional and the interpersonal, and how those show up. So I want to talk about the automatic kind of behavior we exhibit that we don't even realize are from institutional racism and reinforce them, because we don't have the historical knowledge of how they were implemented. And obviously tipping is a really great one, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But another one is not putting your money in people's hands and setting it on the counter. That is actually a direct behavior that is descended from an institutional system, right? And that is where the interpersonal and the institutional in that moment, regardless of in an automatic movement, actually display itself. So I think it's really important throughout this conversation that we really talk about those automatic actions that we exhibit every day that we don't even realize are a part of a larger institutional practice. We have generational ways, which means that behaviors that have been passed down to us that are societal norms are also reinforcing the institutional racism.
Thank you, Ashton, and thank you for that very clear example. And I think the two examples that you and Shelley have given flow very nicely into our next slide, which is systemic racism. So systemic racism is the joint operations of institutions that produce racialized outcomes, with malice and without. So the way that we see that showing up is through power inequities, unequal access to opportunity, and different policy outcomes by race that like cannot be explained, right? And the thing about systemic racism, and I always say this, it's one of the best well-designed systems ever created because it's cumulative, it's pervasive, it's durable, and it's adaptive, right? It's not a static thing, right? And it's culture. And that can be so, and it's so permeated. But what does it mean? Like, how do we throw a cog in that system, right? How do we prevent these things from being replicated? And some examples of systemic racism can be seen in our achievement and opportunity gap. It can be seen in health outcomes, right? So there was a really phenomenal New York Times article, I believe it was last year, that talked about maternal health. And even when you absolve for access to healthcare, education, and wealth, Black women still have a higher maternal mortality rate than any other race. And some of these things, like I said, you may look at them and may think that they can be ascribed to interpersonal or individualized racism, and they can't, because we see in which the ways in which the system works together to prevent our folks from being free, our folks from being nourished, our folks from being housed, our folks from being employed, and that's intentional. And I know this can feel really heavy, but we're here to tell you the truth. So I just want to make sure that I'm checking in with our folks, and I'm really loving what I'm seeing in the chat and folks talking about how this stuff compounding. We're seeing examples around medical racism, and we're seeing this right now in COVID and access to vaccines. We're seeing examples that like when, as a person who works in government and trying to solve for policy outcomes, how things are so intertwined. They're so intertwined and cannot be distended from class, from gender, and how those things work together. So before we jump from systemic racism and we hop into the topic of the evening, I want to make sure that Shelley and Ashton, if you had any, wanted to fill in any gaps or uplift anything that I may have missed. I'm getting a thumbs up. Shelley, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking that it's so important to be rooted in these definitions. So it's really great to have this conversation in the beginning. And as you shared, it's really a sensitive topic. So thank you all for all of the comments in the chat and the vulnerability that's being expressed there around these really sensitive but real necessary conversations to have.
Thank you so much for being here and for holding that space. And I'm really appreciating to see all the voices from our students coming through pretty strong. So thank you. So in understanding racism, we want to be clear on how we're rooting our conversation, and actually how I show up in the work and the work that we lead through the Office of Racial Equity. So we can go to the next slide. So anti-Blackness is something a system in which, a belief system that both voids Blackness of value while systemically dehumanizing Black people and marginalizing their issues. And anti-Blackness flows in all communities. It can be seen in even in our non-Black and our BIPOC communities. It can be seen there too, right? And it's also an unethical disregard for Black people, our institutions, and our policies. And what I want to say about this is that in the aftermath of our Black uprising, it's really important to name and center our work in dismantling anti-Black racism. We have to get at the root of it. We can't sit in safe definitions around diversity or inclusion, right? Because in some ways, we're not centering the folks who are closest to the pain and allowing them to access the power needed to change things on behalf of themselves and their communities. And there are a lot of things that, I think anti-Black racism is also not like a zero-sum game. So like me focusing on that is not anti-you, right? So me being pro-me is not anti-you, but, our system has been very anti-me, my family, my ancestors since the founding of this country. And if we're gonna unwound and really untangle systemic racism, we have to start with anti-Blackness. and how it manifests and changes and morphs within our different communities, our different systems, and different policies, right? Because you could still have you could still have a policy that benefits people of color, and Black folks will still end up not benefiting, right? So that's why we have to have these intra-community and cross-cultural conversations to figure out what's what and how do we get at the root. And then I want to go to the next slide. And I feel like, oftentimes folks are like, why do we do this work? What does this actually mean? Should I just join a book club? When we focus on, we always lead and start with race, because if we start there, we can actually have real and meaningful conversations about some of our most pernicious issues in society today, okay? And systemic racism, no matter where you all find yourself in the food system, no matter if you are going to be a doctor or a business owner or, a policymaker or an environmental justice activist, whatever, like all of your work must be rooted in dismantling systemic racism and anti-Black racism. That's where we start. And if we're honest and we can be there, even though it's a raw place and it's hard and heavy, we can make the inroads that we've been hoping to make beyond Black boxes on Instagram or policy statements about the death of George Floyd, and then nothing else after that. Okay, so I think, do I have any more slides left? I think I do, just a couple more. So quick thing, and Shelley and Ashton know this, and I've said this, and I've read this from them as well. It's not enough to be non-racist or to sit into the idea that I'm a good person or that this institution is not so bad. We must always be actively anti-racist. And anti-racism is not just a noun, it's also a verb. It's something that we do, it's a muscle that we flex every single day. Next slide, please. And I also want to end by saying, as students, as educators, as thinkers, as citizens, there are always depths and levels for doing racial justice work. But the main thing that you can do, because I always get that question, what can I do? Which is, please don't ask Black women that question without trying to answer it for yourself, for the love of God. Thank you. It requires ongoing commitment that requires responsibility and accountability and discomfort. And that's real. So I want to thank you all for coming together, grounding in these slides. Thank you to Shelley and Ashton for being my co-stars in this. And I actually want to get the conversation back to you all, because I've been talking way too much, so we could stop sharing. And I'd love to be in conversation. And I would love to start by asking you both to please introduce yourselves. And I want to start with our question from Ella Baker, if that's okay with you all. Yes? Okay. So I want you guys to introduce yourself. And I want to start off with a quote from Ella Baker, who is an incredible civil rights activist. And she said, "I didn't break the rules, but I challenged the rules." I want to ask you both, how are you showing up in the work? And how are you challenging the rules when it comes to our food and hospitality industry and community? So introduce yourselves. How are you challenging and breaking the rules when it comes to our food and hospitality industry? And I'm going to be quiet because I want to listen to Black women.
Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Shelley Dyer, and I'm really excited to be here with you all tonight. Just to introduce myself a bit before I jump into the question, I'm originally from Little Rock, Arkansas, and I come from a family of what I like to call ancestrally guided instead of home cooks, but people who weren't formally trained, but could throw down in the kitchen and just make meals that change your life in one sitting. And also Black people who chose to farm by choice, even after sharecropping was over. The oldest person in my family just stopped farming about 5 years ago, and he's 90. So come from a family that loves the soil and loves the land. I left Arkansas at 17 to attend Spelman College and studied anthropology and sociology there, and then went on to get a master's in education. So I have a background in teaching. that was my first career. And that was really the inspiration for me getting into food systems work, was seeing my students and knowing that they'd eaten hot Cheetos for breakfast because that's what they had access to. There was no grocery store in the neighborhood where the school was that I taught in Vine City in the Atlanta community. And I really wanted to do something about that. So after a couple of years of moving and teaching abroad in Abu Dhabi, I came back and also moved to the Bay, Shakirah, with no job. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I really wanted to do something here in the US about our food systems and really like fight toward equity across our food system. So for me, the way that I am challenging the narrative around food systems work is being open to not having an exactly linear path, starting off in education, moving into work with farmers markets. My first role within the food systems was working at Freedom Farmers Market as the market manager. And that market gets produce directly from African-American farmers. And the farmers market is located in a part of Oakland where there aren't many grocery stores. It's mostly corner stores that are just filled with liquor and really low nutrition food. So working on access in that way through farmers market management. And then I moved on to become a program manager for a Healthy Corner Store Coalition. And that work was really rooted in community organizing, building resident capacity so that the people who lived in the Tenderloin community could actually advocate for their own food justice. So instead of just responding and coming in as some nonprofit program person, really listening to what the communities needed around food. So surveying the community and supporting the food justice leaders in doing those surveys to learn what types of foods were needed, really advocating for more healthy food incentive vouchers around healthy eating within that community so that not only do people have more access to that food in the grocery stores, but they are also able to purchase that food through incentive vouchers. So that's how I come to food system work. And that's how I'm really challenging that narrative, is just being open to doing the work and taking an approach of curiosity and not always knowing exactly what's coming next, but staying committed to equity and justice and letting my passions guide me.
Thank you, Shelley. Ashton?
Okay, this is where I really need to work on, is describing my work to people, but I'm gonna try to do my best. People always ask me when I come to this work, I always have a really difficult time. I am a child of, let's just say, people who loved each other. So I was raised in a non-traditional home. My mother was a sex educator. And so you can imagine being, born to a teenage mother who's a sexual educator that works in schools and on the south side of Chicago, that makes for a interesting childhood. My mom specifically focused on Black, Indigenous, people of color, queer people in the community, but also youth runaways that were a part of that group. And so I can never tell people when I came to the work, because service is honestly a part of how I was raised. And I would love to sit here and tell you that was intentional for my mother, but honestly, it was because there weren't a lot of resources for a single mother with a low budget. And so that meant where she went, I went. Right? And I began organizing at a very young age simply because I didn't know that it was weird and that other children weren't doing that. I simply thought all children went to alderman meetings and did those things. And so that became a normalized system in my life. I went on to really, went to University of Chicago, and through a series of events and everything, really got called to trauma work, specifically support, as someone who has lived in a family with multi-generational domestic violence. It was really important for me to figure out ways to move in and lean in to trauma-informed communication. And I spent a lot of time in college working with organizations, volunteering with that work. And that would eventually kind of transform into me doing sexual assault support and trauma-informed care for people. And then, I did the fancy thing that you're supposed to do. You graduate, you get the good job, and you do all of that. And I hated it. My ADHD neurodiverse self is not supposed to sit at a desk. And so while I was good at my job, I just didn't last long in the not-for-profit or the corporate world. I even tried marketing. And so I went back to my roots. I've been working since I was 15 years old, and one of my first jobs was in hospitality. I feel incredibly blessed that was an option for me, because nowadays teenagers don't really get the option to work at hospitality spaces at the level that I did. I started out as a hostess in a steakhouse. And it taught me a lot of skills. And from then, I just always kind of, through college and on, I just always kind of ended up always coming back to hospitality. And you know, they say I get it honest. One of my grandfathers was a jazz musician. My other grandfather still is a bartender to this day. I am a military, you know, bred. Both of my sides of my families, I've been in the military for generation after generation. I'm actually the first one to go to college. And so, yeah, I that's how it's called to work. What it looks like now is, I would say about 6 years ago, I looked in the mirror and decided that I was really exhausted at the ways that people had erased Black women and Black femmes from the storytelling of hospitality. I was raised mostly in Chicago, but I live in New Orleans now, and I was also raised in Memphis. I've lived a little bit everywhere, but I decided that I needed to use my skills. I am known for being able to solidify information in a way that's really accessible. And so I decided to use my degree in a way that would allow me to take sociological theories and psychological theories and whittle them down for service members so that they would have more tools and more verbal kind of ways to communicate the things that they were going through. And one of the things that I am most known for is really speaking to transformative justice and the necessity to make emotional labor transparent in the hospitality industry. We often talk about food access is so important. That's where everything starts. But we often, I find, get caught in this loop where we talk a ton about the agricultural work and the food access, and we forget that America is actually a service economy. And that it's so important that we actually speak to that, because it is through that transaction that we actually continue to play into plantation economy systems, which I'm sure we'll get into later. But this is the work that I do. And part of that is trying to explain to people that even things as simple as learning about wine and having a colonialist view of how people should taste wine, what wine should look like, how their palate should be built, is part of the white supremacy system that tells people that certain classes, gender, and races are more valuable than others. But also actually really looking over the veil of the myth of the hospitality industry. I am from more of the beverage side. So I came from the bartender sommelier side, and the false narratives that have been spread a ton about how our systems of hospitality come from France, when that's not true. They actually come from the South, and that we didn't actually have the average person in America didn't really even go out to eat often until the 1950s, when fast food became a real thing, and how we have to really reimagine the ways that we talk about the hospitality industry in order to take care of those people who work in there. Because if we can't get to the point of understanding the product we're actually selling in the industry, we can't get to a point of connecting how the prison industrial complex and the corporatization of agriculture affects our communities on a daily basis. That was a lot. Right. I hope that.
Thank you, Ashton. And we're going to unpack that actually with our next question. So for both of you, and I just appreciate the wholeness and the vulnerability that you both bring to the space and sharing your stories. And I'm hoping that the pieces in which you all are sharing are resonating with our folks, and you see yourselves in these stories. And if not, maybe like challenge that and think about like, what does that mean? So the next question that I have for you all, and I'm a policy person, right? I know how to look at an issue and understand what are the ways in which policy with a big P, like legislation, or policy with a small p, like an organizational change, can be enacted in order to change a system or make change on behalf of a population. And one thing that Shelley mentioned when we were discussing the slides is the idea of policy violence, which is really characterized by a Poor People's Campaign. And it talks about a system in which when we have information and data and anecdotes and stories about how something will impact a system or people, we actively make decisions that will negatively impact people and harm them, and pass that into law, or create a fine or a fee, or put that, on the books for our education system. And this happens in ways that are very insidious. So I want to talk about policy violence because it was Audre Lorde's birthday a couple days ago, and one of her most famous, happy birthday, Miss Lorde, Ancestor Lorde, and one of her most famous writing says, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." So I want to ask you both, and we'll start with you, Shelley. What are if we want to dismantle policy violence, particularly as it relates to Black people and Black women, what are the tools and policies that we need to bring forth to radically reimagine our food and hospitality future? So for example, I can give an example, which people don't think about food and housing, but I think about this all the time, in which, for example, San Francisco is majority zoned for single family housing, which means that when it comes to any sort of density or things that are being built, they can't be built in certain neighborhoods. So that means that certain neighborhoods absorb that density, and which leads to gentrification, right? And someone might think of like, oh, single family zone, like that's something that's written into our zoning codes. That's a form of policy violence, which limits our ability to literally move within our own cities, open up businesses in certain areas, own a home in certain areas, because of these forms of policy violence that have been put on the books for a long time. So that's one example I can give you. But again, what are the tools and policies that we need to bring forth to radically reimagine our food and hospitality future? So Shelley, based on your work in the TL and throughout San Francisco and Oakland, I would love for you to start us off.
Sure. Well, there are two policies that come to mind first. There's so many, but the two main ones I'll focus on are, there's such a resurgence around Black people and just people of color connecting with plants, whether that looks like home gardening or being a plant mom. This is one of my plant babies here. It would be so like, just talk about being on the side of like positive voyeurism on the government's end to work with small farms. We know that big farms, large farm and agriculture is subsidized by the government. Small farms are struggling right now more than they ever have, like due to the COVID-19 pandemic and so many other challenges that they're facing. Just imagine if there were some type of subsidized programs for seeds and soil and compost and other food products to be purchased from those small family farms and then redistributed throughout low-income communities and communities of color to be able to really build self-sufficiency. But that's really the ask there, self-sufficiency, so that people don't have to, and communities don't have to rely on any type of government assistance in terms of food distribution. People could grow their own foods just with that in general. And there's another glaring one. This isn't food, but I cannot talk about like policy violence without thinking about what's happening in the cannabis industry in America. There is a multi-million-dollar industry that white people are making so much money off of. Just to put it transparently, the barriers to enter that industry, just in terms of getting a license, it's so expensive that so many people from communities of color cannot even afford to enter that way. Meanwhile, you have a whole prison system that is packed with Black and brown people who maybe they're still for just petty distribution and they're still incarcerated. So it really infuriates me when I think about what's happening and just the disparity between there being, this whole population of people who are able to make a profit off of the cannabis industry. Meanwhile, we still have Black and brown people who are in prison for even petty crimes that are related to cannabis.
And we can't talk about cannabis without talking about water. So that's very much connected to and how that is impacting indigenous lands also in California. So I think cannabis and food are very intricately related and important. But I did want to ask you, Shelley, if we are rejecting that policy violence that we've seen in cannabis, that we've seen in the ability for folks to feed and nourish themselves, what are the policies and tools that inspire you or that you would love to see when it comes to doing this work?
I would love to see, well, in terms of cannabis policy, I think that everyone should be released from prison first. Like that should have happened a long time ago. But anyone who has any type of cannabis related record should be definitely released from prison. And there should be reparations around the time that folks have lost from their family. And if that's their interest and it's a talent of theirs to be able to grow and distribute people who have been in prison from cannabis should be able to get licensed and be able to start their own businesses and, you know, be able to take advantage of this opportunity to build generational wealth for their families. And just with the small scale farming subsidies, it's just that I wish that there were more subsidies available for small scale farmers and for them to be able to get their produce and products out to communities, especially communities who look like those farmers. A lot of those small scale farmers are people of color. So they're able to produce food at a culturally relevant level that these big farms aren't so concerned with. For example, when I mentioned Freedom Farmers Market, I'm from the South. I grew up eating purple hull peas and collard greens. I don't see that. I see collard greens everywhere in California, but I don't see the Crowder peas and purple hull peas that I used to see growing up unless I go to those small farmers that are out of Sacramento, but were raised in the South that are making those foods that I'm used to. So just more policies that support small farm and agriculture would be, I think that would really change a lot for these farmers who are really struggling now.
Thank you, Charlene. And I want to pop over the same question to you, Ashton. We had a really phenomenal pre-conversation before this, so I'm always grateful for any time you give us. But, you know, as it relates through your work, through your educational work, through your hospitality work, through the many hats that you wear, you know, what are the examples of policy violence that we should be mindful of? And then what are the tools or that we should be using to reshape them?
I mean, I think when we talk about service people, and we have to talk about the lack of policies and how institutions have actually been blocking policies for, you know, decades, of some of them longer than decades, 50, 60, 70 years. We have to talk about the sub-minimum wage for hospitality workers and how that's related and also gendered. Right? We need to talk about the ways that, like, the first hospitality workers are domestic laborers who were in homes. They were Black women who were working as cooks, working as caterers in these homes, and that these laws were specifically passed to prevent Black women specifically from amassing financial independence. And the fact that they've been allowed to carry on and erased, and no one until literally 4 years ago wanted to even have a public conversation, is because it benefited a system that already had so much other policy violence against the Black community to erase. For those not aware, the hospitality community is made up predominantly of women. And when you break that down racially, it is predominantly made up of Black and brown women. So it's really, really important. I saw somebody before say, like, how front of the house workers make more than back of house workers. I think it's really, really important that we stop that comparison, because they do two different jobs and nobody in hospitality will be successful about the other. But the others of it is that it's inherently rooted in misogyny, because who used to normally work those front of the house jobs was women. Right? And people didn't have a problem with tipping when Black women and brown women made little money in tips, and nobody wanted those positions. But now that it's become cool and white men are standing behind the bar, it's a problem. And we need to inherently discuss the fact that it's not that simple, but also how it invokes this same theory that field people had it harder than house people. It's gross. That's essentially the same conversation, is that because we can measure a technical capability, that the person who we cannot measure their technical skills, work is less valuable. Let me tell you something. The most powerless person in a restaurant is your server. They don't control your food. They don't control your drink. They don't even control when you are sat, but they are expected with very little information to make sure you have the most enjoyable experience. That requires emotional capacity and emotional intelligence. Like, we have to become really, really about making sure that we don't repeat things that we've heard simply because we don't have more nuanced conversations. But even bringing it back to policy, one of the things that we have to talk about is post-prohibition. We have to talk about the ways that during prohibition, Black and brown communities, specifically the Black and the Chinese community, were able to build communities with generational wealth off of hospitality, and how that's completely been erased. And then after post-prohibition, in those laws that came after, the ATF, which is now known as the TTB, was created. And licensing systems were put in place to specifically make sure that Black and brown people could not get the proper licensing to continue those businesses that allowed them to build wealth. To this day, most cities have a limited number of licenses, liquor licenses that are able to be out there. Let's be clear. Food is wonderful, but people make their money off of hospitality, off of liquor. This is how everybody actually makes their money. And so when a state says we're not giving out any licenses, in order for you to be a business owner, you have to buy it from somebody else. And most of the people who were given liquor licenses were predominantly white people, which requires them to then be anti-racist to even get a conversation about buying it. Imagine what that does to our industry. It completely changes the landscape. And so I think for me, the conversation is about the lack of change in policies. Hospitality has had the least amount of changes out of any industry to policies.
Yep. And if we've seen anything that happened as far as change, it has come off of the backs and work in labor and organizing of Black women. And we can see this from the Fight for 15, some of the inroads that we've seen in California through the work of domestic workers, through fighting for things like overtime, fighting for childcare. A lot of that stuff has come from our hospitality and at the intersection of with our domestic workers as well, who have put their lives, their checks, their schedules, their income on the line in order to push for greater change that some of them may not even see.
Right. And I think it's a different conversation, but I think it's also important to mention how a lot of that is also related to the sex economy, and that it benefits to not change policies around hospitality, because then we have to acknowledge how much the liquor industry, the hospitality industry is directly rooted in the sex economy.
Yes, and I think the two of you are bringing up, given given the industries that you have brought up, from our cannabis industry, from the sex industry, as Black women, we come to this work, we always bring intersectional approaches. That's not just suited within identities, but that's suited in how we understand and see systems and who's most impacted and who are we solving for. And I imagine if we're solving for, if our impetus is to solve for Black trans women, I'm sure we can change a whole lot of shit for a whole lot more people. So we are going to take a quick break in our conversation, even though I'm loving this and I'm just really energized. So we'll take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 7:20. We're gonna have more with Shelly and Ashton. In the meantime, I would love for you all to think of examples based on our conversation of where you have seen policy violence show up in our food, agriculture, and hospitality industry to share in the chat. So with that, we'll take a quick 10-minute break. Please don't be late. Think about those examples, and thank you for your attention thus far. Okay, great. Welcome back, everyone. Follow the sound of my voice back to your laptop, phone, iPad. We're gonna get started again. Thank you so much for this energetic, thoughtful, provocative conversation. I'm really appreciating all the energy and comments and questions and examples we're seeing from our students. So thank you for your engagement. I know it's late and y'all are tired, but thank you for staying with us. I'm going to ask a few more questions to Ashton and to Shelly, and then we'll leave, I think, the last 15 minutes of class for your questions. So thank you for that. And I would like to, if you have questions for us, feel free to put them in the chat as well. We'll try to incorporate them as we're speaking. But I did want to close out our policy conversation. I know, Ashton, there's an additional point that you wanted to make. And then there was another resource of a tool of to dismantle policy violence that I wanted to uplift to the class. So Ashton, did you want to quote? I know there's a couple of pieces to help us ground our understanding as far as when we're talking about liquor licenses that you wanted to drive home.
So someone put in the chat that they were like, I feel like the ownership of production of alcohol products has a huge race disparity as well. And this is actually why there's such a huge race disparity. I want to speak to the fact that not only was it about the fact that people couldn't get licensing, but like in many states, we often talk about Jim Crow era, but what we don't talk about is 1865 labor laws, which would predate them, which would actually state by state put in place laws that would prevent Black people from working specific jobs or being in certain things. One of those that was really, really important for not just even, I want to be clear because we like to talk about 1865 labor laws and Black codes and put them just in the South. Ohio had them, Illinois had them, Pennsylvania had them, Vermont had them, which prevented also Black people from doing specific jobs. So far in my research, I found about 20 states over the years that specifically had laws that stated that Black people could not distill or make any type of alcoholic beverage. These laws really got more stringent. The post-prohibition laws that went into place made this more stringent because obviously during prohibition, everybody was bootlegging. And one of the things we have to talk about is the storytelling around liquor, right? We like to imagine all of these immigrant and white men who are doing all this labor, when in honesty it was actually a lot of Black and brown people who were actually doing a lot of this work. Even in the bootlegging, one of the reasons why Al Capone was one of the most notorious people is because even if he was a racist, he didn't mind that Black people were moving his liquor. And so he was able to create more, he was able to be competitive because he was able to have a larger network than any of his competitors. And so I think it's just important that people remember that, but I think it's also important for people to remember how those laws still exist. I can point to, I don't want to get too nuanced, but Louisiana still has many laws that may have slightly changed, but are byproducts of direct labor laws that started in 1865. So I just wanted to tie that, and I wanted to tie it to the land by stating that also this was a way that many people were able to actually sustain themselves as farmers, right? Is that they were also able to make products that they would ship other places or people would buy directly in their community that would allow them to live a great life outside of just selling their direct vegetables. I mean, when you distill something, you can suddenly sell so much more product, right? Than it is to just selling one sweet potato. You can also make sure fruit doesn't go bad. Fruit wine was a huge thing, and it was something that honestly a lot of women does. I even have resources that show, and another thing I think it's important to state is that we all know the stories of Nearest Green. Well, if you don't, you should look up the story of Nearest Green, who was the person who actually taught Jack Daniels how to distill and was the person who made the recipe. But truth be told, it's not just Jack Daniels. I've been to almost every legacy whiskey house, and all of them have a founder picture, and almost all of them have a team of Black people that were either former slaves or people who were still living on their land who were distilling and making liquor for them. And none of their families have received restitution for those recipes.
So I want to, in that thread of Black ingenuity, resourcefulness, creativity, and labor, when it comes to dismantling policy violence, we have so many examples within history of Black folks rewriting the narrative, right? And telling a different story, and telling a story that's more reflective of the truth, and also stories that are hard and reflect the kind of injustice that we are facing. One example that I've seen in regards to policy violence has been in the idea of mapping. So like I said, I work in local government. I'm very concerned to think about things like zoning, like mapping. Mapping is not a neutral exercise. It actually is very political. And what it does is it creates a system that helps us think about who's included and who's not. The most prominent example we can think about in the last election is gerrymandering, right? And how voting districts are decided. Well, there's a lot of examples throughout history in which we've had Black ingenuity doing counter mapping and creating maps from our anti-lynching activists to chart out violence, right? And those same anti-lynching maps harken to the police force maps that we're doing right now to target to show the use of police violence when it comes to Black folks, because a lot of police departments do not track that, right? One powerful example I want to give in Berkeley, and I'm going to put this article in the chat so you can see that Black ingenuity in fighting policy violence when it comes to mapping. the Black Panther Party worked really hard and got 15,000 signatures in Berkeley to redraw our police district maps and to make sure that you had things like civilian oversight and making laws to make sure that police officers lived in the districts that they patrolled. Now, this was, over 45 years ago, right? In Berkeley. And that was a Black-led effort to beat the policy violence seen in something neutral as districting. So I want to uplift that it takes real people power to help dismantle these really pernicious problems. But we have to tell the truth. We have to tell the whole story. We have to know our history, given the examples that Ashton and Shelley have shared with us. And we can't tell a story in which our folks are passive or enacting or just accepting the oppression that's happening to them. Hell no. Like, our folks were resilient and they were resistors, and they were adaptive as well. So with that said, I want to talk a little bit more about narratives and storytelling. And Ashton and Shelley, you both are writers and educators and speakers. You're constantly telling stories that we haven't heard of and learned about. And I want to ground my next question in a quote from Toni Morrison. So bear with me. So she says, "I wrote the first book because I wanted to read it. I thought that the kind of book with that subject, those most vulnerable, most undescribed, not taken seriously, little Black girls, had never existed seriously in literature. No one had ever written about them except as props. Since I couldn't find a book that did that, I thought, well, I'll write it and then I'll read it." So all of you are storytellers in your own way. And what are the Black food and agricultural histories that inspire you? And what are the new and old narratives that we need to tell? So I'm going to give it over to Shelley to help ground us in that, right?
I'll uplift one name that you've already mentioned tonight, Shakir, and that's Fannie Lou Hamer from the Mississippi Delta region. Fannie Lou Hamer was a descendant, a daughter of sharecroppers, and she really understood that Black farmers had just been at the mercy of being able to borrow plots of land and, sometimes work until they died just to grow crops. And so what she did was she garnered up enough donations to purchase 40 acres of land in the Mississippi Delta. And this is a story of not just resilience, but the collective economics and the spirit, the historic spirit of Black people to share and just be able to uplift each other in order to build power and to feed people, basically. So she shared that land with hundreds of farmers, and people were able to really make a way out of no way for their family. So I want to uplift Fannie Lou Hamer, and also just one of the common questions that I would get when I was working with the Tenderloin Healthy Corner Store Coalition was that, do people really buy food from a corner store? If you put food in a neighborhood like the Tenderloin, are people actually eating it? And that is, it's always such a frustrating question for me. And it's just that if you put healthy, nutritious food that is culturally relevant to people in a community, they will buy it. They'll buy it. So that's one myth that I always like to dispel, is that if that's available, and the key is culturally relevant. So that's why having that community engagement and community organizing around food is so key. You cannot just go into a community and throw whatever whatever Eurocentric standards are around health or nutritious food into a store and expect for people to purchase. People know what kinds of foods they want to eat and are so willing, especially to have those conversations when the relationship and the trust is built. So really having those opportunities to connect with people and learn and hear from them what their needs are is so key in getting food into communities that really need it most. So that's something that I always like to uplift. And also, like, there's so much local food economy being built. If you go to the Civic Center station, you'll see a lot of Asian American and Pacific Islander people from those communities that are sitting and selling. They're selling breads, they're selling a lot of bok choys and different types of Chinese cabbages. And if there's not that food available within the Tenderloin community, people are popping up and creating their own local food economies to sell that food to other people. So that just shows the willingness and the ability for people to really understand that need for healthy food. And folks are really out there creating it for themselves when it's not available.
I really appreciate that example, Shelly. And I think in that same vein of like how we think about local food economies, I also want to like problematize who we think of as far as the originators of like sustainable agriculture and like regenerative agriculture. And Akiko, I know you have lots of powerful feelings about this, about where those practices came from, how those seeds were saved, how those systems were developed, which came directly from Native and Indigenous people, and definitely through the work and labor of Black folks over centuries of time. And I also want to think about as far as the stories and narratives that we don't hear of and don't talk about is the work of Dr. Booker Watley, right? So when we think about like community supported agriculture and CSAs, right, and food boxes, right, we might think of, you know, premier organic farms owned mostly by white farmers who are, you know, helping locavores experience the best of our local food economy. So that idea was not from white folks. So that came directly from Booker, Dr. Booker T. Watley, who was a Tuskegee alum and did incredible work across the South in order to build, he had this incredible multi-acre hydroponic farm where he taught multiple Black farmers how to build direct clientele membership clubs, which would help farmers develop a fair price and guaranteed income and help them with their plotting, but also maximize the food they were growing on their limited acreage and be able to build wealth and maintain and sustain their land. So I want to share an article about that as far as like when we're thinking about stories and whose narrative we're telling and where these things come from, we need to give credit where credit is due. And that's the thing about institutional racism and systemic racism. We are literally erasing folks, their voices, their stories. One thing that I often talk about with Brian Terry, who's one of my mentors, is how there's only been 400 cookbooks written by Black people, like in the past, I believe, since we really saw the dawn of like food publishing, and that was really brought home by Toni Tipton Martin in her book. And if you could just think of like the dearth of who's doing the work, who's in the kitchen, and who's doing the labor, and who's writing down these recipes, but who's getting credit for them, who's building their careers off of them, who's opening restaurants with these recipes. I mean, the thing that really kills me is when we erase people and we erase their narratives, we erase their ability to reach their full potential. That we erase their ability to reach their own self-determination, and then we erase their ability to build wealth and to build Black potential. So I wanted to, really talk with Ashton and Shelley today to figure out, Toni Morrison said, I didn't see what I didn't see it, so I wrote it myself. So how can we take that responsibility and write those stories and tell those narratives? And I don't know, Ashton, if you want to weigh in here, and feel free, Nikiko, like I know you also have a lot of wisdom and knowledge about this too. I'm going to pull you in a little bit, but Ashton.
Yeah, I think in terms of names, I want to bring up George Washington Carver and the way that he has been erased from the global landscape of the fact of like crop rotation. No one talks about that. But we would literally not be able, the land was dying all across America because no one understood crop rotation. This man was writing regular kind of pamphlets of education and giving them away for free. He was showing Black people how to fundraise and build community gardens. You want to talk about your first community gardens? George Washington Carver. That's why you got it. Right? That's why you got them, right? That is literally how you get community gardens. But we also need to just talk about the way that he not just won, but infiltrated and helped support the USDA's founding and how they do it. You have food stamps? Because George Washington Carver talked about to the president about, hey, let me tell you the ways in which crops are going bad and we could be using that to subsidize and give people healthy food during the Depression. We have to talk about him, but then I also want to talk about people that outside the beverage world, no one talks about. Let's talk about Tom Bullock. who not only is the first Black bartender to write a bartending book, he is the first person, period, to write a book about service and hospitality, pre-prohibition. He should be a household name. Julep, that come back in that cocktail, that's a Tom Pollock. Let's also talk about Hercules, who is the first Black chef in the White House, who is an enslaved person, who created the fine dining standard. If you want to go there, let's talk about the bartender in Congress. Yes, there used to be a bar in Congress. We don't have any pictures of him, unfortunately, but many of the whiskey drinks, like the old fashioned, right? You think about all of these cocktails and you're like, well, why did we have them? Because ice was a luxury. It wasn't something that we had. That cocktail, that's created by him. So there's so many people that we don't know the names of and we don't realize are a part of our cultural drinking traditions when they are the people who created them. Our first brewers are Black women who took their cultural roots from West Africa, from making palm wine and other spirits, and came here on plantations. Many of you may not know this, but New Orleans is called the most northern Caribbean city. When we talk about things that are hurtful, and this is not the place to go into it, but I am going to miss it, we have to always talk about disaster capitalism and what we have lost when we allow disaster capitalism to happen. When we talk about the loss of Katrina, I don't think many people in America realize that it was the oldest, not just Black, because people have said it was the oldest multi-generational city in America. And so I think we need to talk about that because New Orleans is also considered one of the birthplaces of hospitality. It has your first brothels, your first hotels. It has your first, before food tourism was a thing, New Orleans had food tourism before it was even a term. Yeah. And so not only do we lose when we forget people's names, but what do we lose when we forget the history of cities?
And we can see a lot of those threads in the history of cities, even in places like San Francisco, right? Where the first steam bear was created, a lot of and we think of, the gold rush, and everyone has this image of the Bay Area being full of these mustachioed white dudes, with a gold pan, in rivers. No, the city was super diverse, from Chinese workers to Japanese workers to Black workers, from indigenous and American Indian workers who have been displaced from their land, that helped shape our agricultural, our vineyards, and some of our first restaurants in the Bay Area. And one example, speaking of stories we should be telling, story of Jupiter, and when it comes to cider, everyone thinks that heirloom cider is just very white. No, you had some of the earliest apple orchards and cultivation happening from folks who were enslaved, and some of their recipes and things that came from that. So I'm really grateful for us to lift up and tell more of these stories and have a fuller understanding of our history. Because I'm a firm believer is if we don't know where we've been, we don't know where we're going. Sorry, Ashton, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I have to say this one thing because I forgot that you guys are in the Bay. But I think we also need to talk about Chinese women and their impact on hospitality, their organizing to create Chinatowns, but also the ways in which they were able to combat laws that were specifically targeted towards them and other Asian women that were calling them basically moral, basically they were these seductress who were making men, seducing men, and there became all of these laws to prevent the literal focus on preventing Chinese people from immigrating here was focused on Chinese women. And I think it's really important for us to discuss that because one of the most powerful women was actually a famous bootlegger who created Chinese restaurants to actually wash her money from bootlegging after Prohibition ended. And no one tells that story. Right. I mean, she was a criminal, but come on now.
That money, it didn't work. I mean, and what other options? I mean, I'm sorry, but what other options were there, right? It's not like there was we had a whole formal economy that was accepting of, Asian women stepping into their power and being business owners. So we got to complicate things. I want you all, your students, right? Ask better questions, complicate things, figure out, what's really going on, and think about the different types of ways in which communities tell stories. A lot of the stuff are oral histories, right? A lot of stuff is not written down. A lot of these things come in the form of quilts or poems or recipes or different foods and flavors. So let's problematize and think about where our storytelling, these narratives come from and who's included and who's not. And if folks are not there, ask why, okay? So I know, Nikiko, I don't know if you want to jump in or give any other examples of storytelling or narratives. We're good? Okay, great, we're gonna keep going. Awesome. And then also making sure, Shelly, did I miss anything with our storytelling?
No, this is great.
Okay, because I mean, I feel like we can talk for hours. So
yes.
But we have a timeline, so I have to keep it moving. So I'm gonna ask our panelists one more question, and then we're gonna open it up to questions that you all had asked us. So my final question for you all this evening is, so Shelly brought up the amazing Fannie Lou Hamer, who's one of my, my ancestral heroes, and her grit and her steadiness, and not even just transforming the Democratic Party, but transforming agriculture in the South and feeding folks was incredible. And one of her quotes, she says, never forget where we came from, and always praise the bridges that carried us over. So my question to you all are, what are the bridges that carried you over? And as a future ancestor, who are you building a bridge for? So I'm gonna start with Ashton, and then I'm gonna go to Shelly.
I think I might need a minute. Shelly,
you ready? Shelly, and then I'm gonna go to Ashton.
There are so many, but one that really comes to mind is just my experiences with my mom in the kitchen and experiences around my mom and food. There was a man named Mr. Jesse who experienced homelessness in our neighborhood. He would camp out, but he would always come by, and he knew that our house was that spot that we typically had just cooked something for dinner. It was, a safe place for people to just come if he needed to take a shower or whatever it was. So when he would stop by and he was hungry, if we hadn't just cooked a meal, we always had sandwiches in my house, whether it was peanut butter sandwiches, fried bologna sandwiches. So I remember the first time I made a fried bologna sandwich for Mr. Jesse, my mom said, "Did you ask him what type of condiments he wanted on it?" So I go outside and ask him. She's like, "What kind of cheese is he like?" "We have cheddar and we have pepper jack." I'm like, "Okay, let me go back out and ask him." And so then as I was like spreading the mayo and mustard on the sandwich, she told me to make sure that I spread it just as neatly as I would if we were having people over for Sunday dinner. And then at the end, when I was slicing the sandwich, she said, "Don't put your whole body weight down on the sandwich. Make sure the bread is nice and fluffy. Make it really presentable." And so what she was teaching me were really some philosophies that guided me throughout my life and my approach to food. And that was that everyone deserves to eat. And it's that, everyone deserves to have choice and agency over what they eat, and that people should have really dignified experiences around food. And those are things that she didn't explicitly say to me, but it was just evident in the way that she treated people around food, meals, and just hospitality in general. And also expected that same respect to be returned to her. So that's one of the bridges that have carried me over and still continue to carry me through this day. And I would say I'm building a bridge for the people who grow up and they never decide they want to do one thing. For me, just out of passion and like genuine curiosity, and there's so much work to do that I'm passionate about doing, I don't think I'll pick one thing to do for the rest of my life. Like I like to have my hands in a lot of different pots, and I'm always evolving. And I feel like in my earlier 20s, I felt very insecure about that. Just like, oh my goodness, like I know people who have decided to take a linear path, being a doctor or a nurse or an attorney. But that's not me to do one thing. And I'm okay with that now. And it feels so liberating to finally feel confident about that. And so I'm just rooting for all the people who won't pick one career path and need someone to just let you know that, hey, it's okay. I'm doing it. You make it, you figure it out. It's really cool and fun to constantly evolve, and it's life. And as far as I know, we get one shot at this. So there's so many things to just commit life to learning, exploring, and always doing things that uplift and are for the good of people.
Thank you so much, Shelly. I'm just absorbing your wisdom there. It's thank you. Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, that was beautiful. Bridges that have tied me over. You know what? Probably from my great grandmother. I was really raised. That's not what I want to say. I was really blessed to, me and my mother lived with her when I was young. And she, I just think she was raised on a farm. They literally had a horse and buggy. And she just always gave perspective, right? And I think one of the things that I learned from her is that money is only a privilege if you know how to use it. Creativity and imagination can take you much further. And so, she always kind of reinforced for me not to choose the thing that was going to pay me in in finances, but was going to pay me in like social wealth. She'd ask me, who'd you get to know? Who'd you meet today? And I think that has kind of like lived with me, but I think more importantly, I think of my great grandmother and I think about how she transformed so many times throughout her life and how she wasn't, I think I might be the last grandbaby before she became a church-going woman. When my great grandmother, when I was born, she was still smoking cigarettes and saying shit. And so it was a beautiful thing to see like that woman become a woman who also became something else. And what I thought was most, just her life inspired me. But like, I remember one day, I remember I was in high school and I was so angry. I was a very angry teenager and young adult. And I remember she looked at me and she said, life's hard, but you don't gotta make it, it ain't gotta make you hard, baby girl. That's a choice. And that's something that always comes back to me. And then my grandfather, who is still a bartender, he said to me when I felt all this shame and pressure about like, well, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to be like graduating from college and working this type of job and, making sure all my cousins and everybody sees me. I'm the first one. And he said, the only one who got to deal with your shit at the end of the day is you, because you're the only one laying your head on that pillow. So he was like, I got a lot of mistakes I done made. I got a lot of bad decisions I done made. He goes, but they're all mine. He's like, it's a lot harder to go to sleep with someone else's shit on your pillow. I come from a family of cussers, just so y'all know, if y'all haven't figured it out. And so, I am really, really grateful that I had people who just allowed me to be me. And those are the bridges that carry me. And then I would say something that I kind of like, the bridge that I want to create is always choose you. No matter what it is, always choose you. I think so often we get so caught up. We have so much internalized stories from capitalism that tell us in order to have value, we got to look like this or perform like this or talk like this or be in community with this. Even within the activism and organizing community, organizing must look like this. Don't be too loud. Don't be too ratchet. Don't be da-da-da-da. You need to do all the things. I'm a masterful code switcher. Like, look, I think we must discuss about the fact that like nothing will work if you do not choose you. And the thing about choosing you is not choosing the ego and the performance of you. It's talking about choosing you, meaning even the toxic shit. Be honest with yourself about the parts of you who haven't grown. Like that is the bridge that I want to create. I canceled a conference that I'm supposed to have this weekend. People were like, that's crazy. That's crazy that you're going to cancel this conference. But mentally, spiritually, emotionally, I couldn't do it. I I chose myself because guess what? Too many of us have died from weathering and burnout. Your body will literally break down on a cellular level if you don't choose you. So choose you. Because guess what? You damned if you do, if damned if you don't. You might as well get another day to have another drink.
I love you, Ashton.
That's all I got.
Thank you, Ashton, and I choose you, Shelly. I choose me, but I choose you too.
Choose you, Shakirah.
Thank you.
I choose y'all.
Thank you. I'm going to quickly answer the question, just give a little insight, but I definitely want to spend the last couple of minutes with some good questions from our students. But thank you, Ashton and Shelly. I was just like, I think I felt Miss Hamer in the room.
Yeah.
And the bridges that have carried us and the bridges that we continue to build. And I too, receive energy and joy from my grandmother, my grandmothers, Minnie Ima Shabazz and Rebecca Simley, who I just can't, just unimaginable the violence, the discrimination, the troubles that they face, and just still were able to raise some just like badass Black babies and teach us to love the skin that we are in and to be proud and to walk with our head high, and to never leave the house in a bonnet, right?
Yeah.
Always come correct, even if you're going to the corner store. Miss Minnie, my grandmother, she was a Black Panther. She was a social worker. She was a community leader in Harlem. And, she wasn't a cookie baking grandma at all. She's like, you want some cookies? You got a job? You can go get yourself your own cookies. Like, that was my Grammy. And yet, her feminism, her ferocity, and her truth still live on. And I feel like I'm somehow morphing into her. And I'm so proud. So, and the same for my grandmother, Rebecca Simley, in holding me and always having a bowl of Black cherry Jello in her fridge with Cool Whip for our afternoon chats while I finished my homework. And she looked at me over the table and stealing a couple of sneaks from it because she was suffering from diabetes, but she always would have little treats when I was around. And I've lost both of them way too soon. They were very young when they passed away. But I can't imagine the beams and the structure of those bridges are so strong that I feel like I need to pass that on. And for my brothers and my sisters, I'm the eldest out of 5, to maybe one day, if I'm blessed to have a family, to build bridges for our future generations. Because this can't stop, it doesn't start with us. So I want you all to think about, all of you are going to be future ancestors one day. And who are you building a bridge for? And how are you doing that in a way that supports, respects, and trusts Black people, Black women? And how can we build a food system that also values those things? So with that said, we have like 3 minutes left. So Eva or Will, if there's a question that you want to uplift, I wanted to make sure we did that. But if not,
Shakirah, what I would love to do is just riding on the inspiration that you've all given us, is let all the students populate the chat with answering the question of what bridge carries them. And we can actually use that also to take attendance. So it serves a double duty, but it'll also give everyone a moment in this time of being really inspired by all of your wisdom to participate. So I just want to invite all the students right now in the next 2 minutes to enter into the chat. What is the bridge that is carrying you or is lifting you to the next place in your life right now? And we can follow along. Don't be shy.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you. Also, without a doubt, while everybody's putting into the chat, this edible ed class absolutely goes right to the top of the greatest hits list for 10 years of classes. So thank you, the three of you, for that. This is nice to watch.
Thank you for inviting me. This was such a pleasure. Shelley, thank you. I appreciate us meeting. I know your work, but thank you. This has been such a pleasure. And thank you, everybody, the whole team who put this together and carried it. Shakirah, you already know how I feel about you, sis. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashton.